This summer, Britain's racists and cynics have whipped up a moral panic over a few hundred desperate people crossing the channel in rubber boats. Earlier today, a Sudanese teenager who had disappeared at sea was found dead on a beach near Calais. The consequences of the toxic politics of Nigel Farage, Priti Patel, and their media cheerleaders has become tragically clear. So why would a 16-year-old risk the deadly crossing between France and Britain? And how can we build a politics in this country which doesn't end in desperate teenagers drowning at sea? That's our main theme for tonight's show. I'll be joined in a moment by an expert from the Joint Council for the Welfare of Immigrants to help answer those questions. As for the rest of the show, I'll talk you through two outrageous recent cases of government cronyism. That's Javid heading to JP Morgan and Dido Harding being lined up to head the successor to Public Health England. I'll explain why that's controversial. And then we've got an interview with housing activist Isaac Rose about resistance to the wave of evictions in the pipeline when the government's ban on evictions runs out on Sunday. And we'll end by discussing the surging support for Scottish independence with Michael Gray. As always, share the show link and tweet all of your thoughts, your comments, your questions on the hashtag Tisky Sour. This morning, as I've said, we found out the tragic news that a 16-year-old Sudanese teenager was found drowned on a beach close to Calais. So he'd disappeared trying to cross the channel on Tuesday evening. As you would imagine, this case has been used by our Home Secretary as an excuse to rally against human traffickers exploiting vulnerable people. But to my mind, this both denies agency to migrants and lets the government off the hook. The reason people die at open sea is not because they have been duped by smugglers, but because governments like ours deny safe routes for people to seek a better life. So to discuss this tragedy and its political origins, I'm joined by Minnie Rahman of the Joint Council for the Welfare of Immigrants. Thank you so much for joining us this evening, Minnie.
Hi, Michael.
We're going to focus on the politics that led to this tragedy. So talking about the response, the policy response, the political response. But first of all, to sort of introduce the discussion, because this is, I think, where many of the misunderstandings that we hear in the mainstream media arise. Could you talk a bit about why someone would be coming from Sudan and why someone would be traveling from France, which we're constantly told is a safe country, and risking their life to try and come to Britain?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I don't claim to be an expert on the politics of Sudan, but I think it's pretty obvious that there is a military regime there. There are huge human rights abuses going on there on a regular basis. It is a country which regularly displaces millions of people. Now, I think if you put that in the historic context of the UK, Sudan was under colonial rule until the 1950s. That means that there are strong relationships with the UK there. We also have a huge Sudanese community population in the UK of around 20,000 people, which, although doesn't sound like that many, is one of the biggest in Europe. So that indicates the strength of the relationship between Sudan and the UK. And as I said, the majority of people who are seeking refuge are leaving Sudan and are being displaced in countries next to Sudan. There are a small number of people who then enter the EU and seek asylum in places like Greece and France and Italy. The majority of asylum seekers do so in those EU countries. The UK takes relatively few. And then you have an even smaller group of people who are trying to enter the UK because they've got connections, because they've got relationships. So either they've got family and friends in the UK or a support network which can offer them safety and support, or they speak English and think that they will be able to get on with their lives here. So it makes sense that when you get to France and you get to Calais, that there are perhaps unaccompanied children, like in this case, who are desperately trying to reach friends and family in the UK, but have no way to do so because you simply cannot apply for asylum unless you are already on British soil.
Yeah, we're going to talk about that policy of your demand for safe passage in a moment. First of all, I want to look at the immediate political response in a bit more detail. So Priti Patel, the Home Secretary, once this news came out, immediately tweeted, this is an upsetting and tragic loss of young life. This horrendous incident serves as a brutal reminder of the abhorrent criminal gangs and people smugglers who exploit vulnerable people. Working together, we are determined to stop them. She's there quote tweeting the French Minister for Citizenship, who's saying basically the same thing, very similar message. And her opposite number, Nick Thomas Simons, tweeted at about the same time, "This is utterly heartbreaking, thoughts with his loved ones. The situation is lacking in humanity and totally unacceptable. the government urgently needs to work on a solution with international partners and address the exploitative behavior of criminal gangs. This is costing lives. Now, I suppose to credit where it's due, Nick Torfan actually came out with, or Nick Thomas Simmons, apologies, came out with a much stronger letter to Priti Patel, which was pointing out the need to have sort of humanity in this situation, to not militarize the border. But the initial tweet, like Priti Patel's, focused on, I suppose, the very easy subject. Politicians find it very easy to talk about criminal, exploitative smugglers. And Minnie, I'm sure you get this a lot in your profession, in your field. Do you think, what do you make of this sort of position, this sort of instant reaction to say the problem is exploitative smugglers, as if, you know, if there weren't exploitative people trying to make some money out of this, the problem would go away?
Yeah, absolutely. I find the focus on people smugglers quite disingenuous, if I'm quite honest. Like, of course, people smugglers and traffickers are a problem, but they're empowered by the system that we have in place. And the government, Priti Patel, has been told time and time again, and so have Labour politicians, this is a problem that has been going on for decades, for years and years, that if you make those routes unviable, if you crack down on routes of entry, the only thing you do is push people directly into the hands of people smugglers, because you don't allow them to enter the UK in a safe and if you like, controlled manner. So it's pretty disingenuous of the government to abdicate responsibility. And this is a pattern of behaviour that we've seen regularly from the Conservatives, where they try to push responsibility back onto France, where they abdicate responsibility from themselves and don't recognise that there are real solutions in front of them. Last year, when 39 people died in the back of a truck, Priti Patel was told the same thing, that you must open routes of entry into the UK, otherwise people will die trying to get here. And even worse than that, last year, the Foreign Affairs Select Committee released a report which said this exact thing, that if you crack down on borders, if you militarise the border, then you will ensure that people die crossing. Priti Patel was on that committee, and yet she's still ignoring all of the solutions that are right in front of her.
What is your policy response then? I know that you advocate what you call safe passage, but sort of in practice, in practical terms, what would that look like?
So there are actually many, many solutions that the government could implement that would be more pragmatic and sensible and actually easier to implement. So what that looks like is you could introduce an asylum claims processing centre in France, so that someone can apply for asylum from abroad, have their claim granted and assessed, and then travel here safely. You could likewise introduce humanitarian visas so that people can go to a British embassy, have their claim assessed by the government, and travel here safely. We also have several existing routes for refugees and asylum seekers that are extremely limited and narrow, and that the government has either removed in the last year or narrowed down further. So, for example, the Syrian resettlement programme that allows Syrians to come from abroad safely to the UK. Since March, we haven't resettled a single Syrian person under that scheme. So not only does that need to be restarted, but also that could be broadened to include other countries. Likewise, in this case, particularly relevant for unaccompanied asylum-seeking children, earlier this year, the government stopped its commitment to the Dubs route, which is a route which has allowed asylum-seeking children to come specifically from Europe into the UK. They closed down that route earlier in the year. So as I say, you know, if the government is really serious about making sure that people don't die making these journeys, that these journeys stop altogether, and that people traffickers and smugglers are stopped, then they would reopen these routes and take a new approach, an approach that hasn't been taken for the last 20 years, and an approach that would actually stop this problem at its very root, rather than sort of playing around the edges.
Yeah, I mean, that to me seems like the rational policy response. I imagine most of our audience will agree, but obviously this is occurring in a political context which is miles to the right of anything you are suggesting. To get an idea of that, I mean, we've shown many of the videos that Nigel Farage has been putting out on his social media. On Sunday, Natalie Elphick, MP for Dover, joined in. So she performed a similar sort of anti-migrant stunt. Let's take a look at that.
I'm here at the White Cliffs, and this boat has arrived only moments ago. In it, 8 people, 7 fit men and 1 woman. They have come off, thrown their life jackets into this high-end dinghy with its top-flight Honda motor engine and run away into breaking into Britain in this way. It is only when the French stop the boats leaving the shore that they intercept dinghies like these in the channel and return them to France. And if they do arrive here on our shores, that they are returned quickly and promptly back to France. That will put an end to small boats crossing.
So apologies for the poor sound there. She needs to invest in a lapel mic. That's kind of besides the point. If you did manage to decipher what she was saying, you could hear all of the sort of buttons she was trying to press. She says these were fit men in a high-end dinghy breaking into Britain. What do those words do? So fit men, it's to say these people are a threat. They're not vulnerable people. They're threatening people who are a danger to you. She says it's a high-end dinghy. She talks about the top motor, I think, as if she's on a sort of telesales program, and that's to try and suggest these aren't people in need. They're privileged people. They're trying to rob our welfare state when they don't need it. And then she says they're breaking into Britain. These people are criminals, essentially. This is all bullshit. It's, people are within their right to claim asylum in whatever country they wish. There are mechanisms, yes, which the government can draw upon, the Dublin Convention, to sort of say, we don't have to process your asylum claim, but it's perfectly legal to try and claim it here. Obviously, I don't need to tell you that these aren't, people who are just coming, who are rich, happy people, privileged people, not desperate at all, who are just coming to take the piss and wean money off our welfare state. You know that's bullshit. But even though I suppose it seems laughably stupid, it has obvious consequences. We discovered that again today. So there was a story about in her constituency, so in Natalie Elphick's constituency, a migrant who had, or a refugee, someone seeking asylum, who'd arrived on a boat, was attacked by a member of the public. So a member of the public who'd said, look, if these are fit, healthy people trying to rip us off, if they're criminals, and as Natalie Elphick's colleagues are constantly saying, human rights laws means we can't get rid of them, then if you are a rabid far-right racist, what are you going to read from that? Human rights laws won't let us get rid of them, so should you take action into your own hands? Well, it seems like that's what this man, that's the message he got. Millie, I want to get your thoughts on this, and especially sort of vigilantism as a particular risk, which seems like a heightened one in this country at the moment, that not only do we have a sort of legal system which abuses and discriminates against migrants, but the kind of politics that's being whipped up by Nigel Farage, Natalie Elphick, and being reinforced actually by even the Home Office Twitter account. Do you think that's going to lead to more of this vigilante direct action where far-right violent people attack people, seeking a safe haven?
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is something that we have to be really concerned about and is actually very, very dangerous. The far right often use migrants or refugees crossing the channel as a way to push back their own narratives around border control and the EU. It's a way to play political football with people's lives. But what they actually do is create really dangerous environments, not just for migrants and asylum seekers and refugees, but also for British people of colour. We saw after the EU referendum similar narratives being used around migrants, and hate crimes shot up massively in 2016. Now we're at a point where we're in the midst of a pandemic. There is a crisis, people are feeling frustrated, and then you have a government encouraging dangerous narratives which are actually being set by the far right rather than by any other political player, and responding to that. And what we can expect to see is people becoming more and more frustrated and essentially taking part in vigilantism. We actually know that this is something that happens regularly in Kent. It's not actually a new thing. There have been regular patrols of sorts from the far right on beaches trying to take matters into their own hands. And I find it astounding that the government, takes such a hard line on criminal behaviour and illegal entry into the UK, whilst also simultaneously allowing illegal behaviour from far right groups. So I think it's really important that we're aware of this, and that's why it's even more vital to tell the government that what you're doing is ridiculous, it's not pragmatic, it's not sensible, and it's dangerous, and that there are really easy solutions, and not to let them get away with allowing this narrative to spread through society.
And so, you brought up narratives and sort of suggested that we're often having this debate on right-wing terms. And you might disagree, but to me, it looks like we're losing this argument. Over the last 5 years, progressives sort of made great waves when it came to sort of reframing how we talk about the economy. They basically won arguments on nationalisation, austerity, etc. on migration, it seems like, you know, the right are very comfortable talking about that. They're making the political weather. And to me, sometimes it seems like progressives, the left, haven't quite got clear what their narrative about migration is. So I was listening to, you know, talk radio today, or it's LBC, I think, with Sheila Fogarty. I think that's the name, Sheila Fogarty. Anyway, she's one of their more left-wing liberal hosts. And there were people sort of calling in and saying, you know, what you want, what you're calling for is complete open borders. And she's saying, no, I'm not. What I'm calling for is for people to be able to apply for asylum. There's going to be a system in place, which means that, you know, we are assessing people as to whether they should be here or should not be here. And then at the same time, you've got sort of, I feel like the dominant argument on the left is, no, actually, we don't agree with you, Sheila. What we want is open borders, no borders. And it means that it seems it's kind of confusing what the message from progressives is on this issue to me. And I know that obviously you work on this, you go on TV a lot talking about migration. I mean, where do you think the political space is where the left can win this argument?
Yeah, I mean, it's a difficult question to answer. And I think you're right that there's been a failure amongst progressives and the left to talk about migrants in a human way, in a real way that isn't based on sort of economic principles or the value that they bring and contribution. And there is like a balance to be struck there. And I think we have to be practical and pragmatic in a lot of ways. Like, of course, we would want a system in which people can move freely at some point between countries, but we are nowhere near that system. And actually, the call for open borders is miles away from the reality of what is actually happening on the ground. And there is an argument to be made there about preserving systems which work and systems which have protected people's rights. For example, freedom of movement is the only migration system that has, for the most part, protected people's rights, and calling for practical solutions. So I think there's a conflation of issues going on as well. You know, we're talking about an asylum system that's separate, that is separate from workers' rights and how people enter as economic migrants to work and study. And people on the left just don't have a grasp on how we make those arguments based on people's needs and the reality of migrants' lives. And I think that's where we have to start making quite a bit of difference. I also think we have to start allowing migrants a voice themselves and being allowed to speak on these issues too, because they have historically been pushed down and away from this argument and have not been given the platform to say what it is that they are experiencing, which I think is vitally important. So I actually think that the space for migrants' rights campaigners does come now as we sort of enter in a post-corona economy, if you would like to call it that. Obviously, we're still in the midst of a pandemic. But as we start to think about recovery, we have to think about who migrants are and who they have been during this crisis. Some of them have been key workers. Some of them have been forced to continue working in unsafe conditions because they haven't had access to public funds and have been exposed to the hostile environment. So we have to start thinking about their real experiences and call for migrants' rights to be protected as part of economic recovery.
Do you think we're kind of, I know this is a bit of a curveball maybe, but I feel like maybe we're missing a trick in sort of saying how weak it makes this country seem, that we accept, or we make it seem like a crisis when we have 4,000 people crossing the channel, when we accept a number of migrants, which is pitiful compared to other countries. And instead of, I suppose there's sort of two ways of doing it. One, it's to sort of center people who are migrating and try and build up solidarity towards them, which obviously incredibly valuable. The other is to sort of say, what kind of country are we? Which, you know, kind of civic nationalism-y, progressive patriotism vibe, which for obvious reasons isn't tried by the left. But I kind of wonder, do you think there could be any traction with that? Do you think that could be something that's worth trying?
I think anything is worth trying at this point, if I'm honest. Yeah. The thing that I don't think has been tried, and I think the thing that would be actually really interesting, is to make the comparison between what people have experienced in the UK during this pandemic. I think there's a really strong argument and a new civic consciousness about what it feels like to be separated from your family and your loved ones, even within this country, and how that feels. And now imagine that in a broader context, and also the civic consciousness about being reliant on public services like access to healthcare and housing, good quality housing, and the welfare state and how we're all basically one paycheck away from being exposed to a really sinister system, and making those connections between that is what migrants experience on a daily basis, and now you can understand how this would affect a normal person, and migrants are just people who are being exposed to a really terrible system.
Minnie Rahman, thank you so much for spending your time with us this evening. Very insightful. This story is going to keep going on and on, so I'm sure we'll speak to you again soon.
Thanks very much.
I'll read a tweet. Ime Uwase, I hope I've pronounced your name right, tweets on the hashtag TiskiSour. Thank you to Minnie Rahman, Michael Walker and Novara Media for discussing the heartbreaking tragedy of asylum seekers who are dying at European borders. British and European governments have to be held to account. I agree, that is something we have been trying to do over the past weeks, months, years, is hold our governments to account for this, horrific tragedy, because obviously very few sections of our press are willing to do so. We've got over 1,300 people watching. Let's get that closer to 2,000. So share the show link. We're going to go on to our next story, which, it's going to have a lot of themes which might be familiar to you. So the Conservative response to coronavirus has been chaotic, but it's undeniable that it's easy to find some constant themes. So first, failure. This country has had more excess deaths than anywhere in Europe and the deepest recession in the G7. Second, blame shifting. So when something goes wrong, the government doesn't put their hands up and say, sorry, we made a mistake. They try and find anyone else in the country or outside of the country, of course, to blame for it. I suppose a prominent example here is when the government blamed the huge death toll in care homes, not on their policy to not stop people going in and out of care homes or to stop agency workers going between care homes without enough PPE, but on care home workers themselves. And third, cronyism. So again, a prominent example here, we've talked about it recently, government advisors being handed millions of pounds to provide PPE that just doesn't work, doesn't fit requirements, never gets used, but millions of pounds finds its way from the public coffers into the pockets of people who happen to be quite close to this Tory government. Now, I have a story for you which rolls up all three of these issues, all three of them. So on failure, we're going to get straight into this. Britain's response to coronavirus was obviously, you all knew it, hampered by poor testing, poor capacity back in March and April. Now, the obvious reasons for this, you had a government which has slashed the funding for Public Health England. It was slashed about 25% since 2015. And the government's failure to prepare back in January, late January, and the whole of February, when Boris Johnson missed 5 COBRA meetings, when there had already been a pandemic warning from the World Health Organization and Britain was still dragging its feet. Now, the British government has recognized now finally that was a mistake, that we should have had more capacity then, but they don't want to admit that was because of their own austerity policies or because of their own complacency. No, they want to blame it on a different institution. And what they've come up with, as the scapegoat for this issue is Public Health England. So the government have announced that they're going to scrap the body Public Health England, which is in charge of things like testing and general public health, very important organisation. The implication is that the catastrophic response to COVID is not the fault of a prime minister who missed all of these COBRA meetings, but this organisation. It's transparent, to say the least. Now let's go on to... No, I'm not going to go on to cronyism now. Yeah, cronyism. I am going to go on to cronyism. I'm on number 3 already. So cronyism is the practice of giving out contracts and jobs to people who aren't necessarily qualified for those jobs or those contracts, but who have connections to the government. And, friends, associates, people who have given donations, perhaps. That's often one. And this comes back, this feature of government policy in terms of coronavirus rears its ugly head, because on Tuesday, Matt Hancock didn't just announce that Public Health England would be abolished. He announced that its successor, the National Institute for Health Protection, would have as its boss this woman, Dido Harding. You might recognize Dido Harding from her government briefings. She was appointed to head the much criticized and Serco-run, so outsourced, test and trace system. Before that, Harding was head of telecommunications firm TalkTalk, which was the first company ever to be voted as having the worst customer services 2 years in a row by the money mouse. This is someone who was put up to run the test and trace system, background in corporations, not in health whatsoever. And her background in the corporate sector was not really covered in glory. Let's get this up. So this was when she was the boss of TalkTalk. This was her credentials to get this very high-powered job. And back in 2012, TalkTalk became the first company to win Money Mail's Wooden Spoon Award in consecutive years. So in the past, a winner has taken the wooden spoon as a wake-up call and improved its customer service. But TalkTalk, led by Dido Harding, who's now in charge of Public Health England, evidently didn't improve them. She lost again. I think we can also see a picture, and because you might want to question this woman's judgment, she actually appeared with a wooden spoon, took a picture with the wooden spoon, with the award for poor customer service. Odd decision, to say the least. Back then, so if we're still looking at sort of her credentials to run a major public organization, it wasn't just poor customer service that got TalkTalk in trouble. They were also fined £400,000 and ultimately lost 95,000 customers because they breached the data of, I think, 4.2 million people, or they put 4.2 million people's data at risk. 157,000 of those had their details stolen, including 15,000 whose bank accounts were compromised. Not necessarily someone you want in charge of a test and trace system, which is going to have very, important, personal, sensitive data about all of us. But there you go. These sort of deficiencies, let's say, in Dido Harding's CV have been recognized by some in the mainstream media and by the opposition, for example. And what I want to show you now, though, is Matt Hancock this morning being questioned about Harding's record on the BBC.
And there has been some criticism about the appointment of Baroness Dido Harding to be in charge of this new body. One expert said Dido Harding's appointment makes about as much sense as Chris Whitty, the Chief Medical Officer, being appointed the Vodafone Head of Branding and Corporate Image. Why is she the right person for this job? Is she qualified for it?
Yeah, absolutely. She's simply the best person who could be doing this job now. She has enormous experience, both in the private sector, running very large organisations, and this is a very large organisation now, with a budget of over £10 billion. Also in the NHS. She's been the chair of NHS Improvement for the last over 3 years. She's been expanding and building that testing capacity, the test and trace system that we talked about, and that is so effective in finding people now and asking them to self-isolate. We're very lucky to have her giving this public service at such a critical time.
Hancock.
He's the government minister who always looks the most uniquely terrified of any of them. He goes on TV. He almost seems like he's apologizing for what he's saying. He doesn't believe it himself. Anyway, the evidence he gave there as to why she's the right person for the job is she has 3 years experience in the health service. Now, fine, 3 years experience in the health service, fine, whatever. But this isn't someone who... there was no open process by which you could apply to this job. She didn't sit an interview. So to give this job to someone without any kind of transparent formal process, I think their, qualities have to be a bit more exceptional than just 3 years in the health service. Let's give her the most important job in British public health. He put there also as his sort of example as to why she's the right person for the job, the apparently extraordinary success of the test and trace system. Now, I'm not going to give you my amateur assessment of how successful that's been. I'm going to give you John Edmonds. So he was one of the top modelers, or still is the top modeler, in fact, that sits on SAGE, so the government's scientific advisory group. This is him speaking earlier this month on Newsnight.
So this idea that we were going to have a world-beating system was nonsense.
Honestly, I couldn't care less whether it's world-beating or not. I just want it to be virus-beating, and it's not.
So that was Edmonds on test and trace. He doesn't care if it's world-beating. He just wants it to be virus-beating. It's not. So that's supposed to be our extraordinarily successful test and trace system. Edmonds is not the only SAGE member with concerns about the test and trace system. We can go to some quotes from Stephen Riker. So he's also a member of SAGE. He was a member of the subcommittee advising on behavioural science. And in The Guardian this morning, he said this of Harding's test and trace system. So first, it was based on a high-tech app, now junked. Then it was organized around a centralized telephone system rather than tried and trusted local public health systems, an approach that has also now been semi-junked. From the outset, this was outsourced to various companies such as Serco, which provided call handling staff and with which ministers have previous associations. This approach was entirely the government's choice, implemented by their chosen appointee, Dido Harding. It was transparently ideological and demonstrably inefficient. Indeed, Serco's telephone tracers were around 50% successful in reaching contacts. Public health tracers were over 90% successful. So we've got here two top scientists saying the one high-profile job this person has had in science, in pandemic control, she didn't perform particularly well. Now you might be asking, how is it the case that this person who's worked in public health for 3 years, before that she worked in the corporate sector and oversaw some pretty disastrous crises in a telecommunications bit, how does that person get appointed as the head of public or the replacement for Public Health England without an interview? Now, I'll give you some clues or some evidence. Obviously, I can't draw definitive connections here, but you can make your own mind up when I tell you some of the, I suppose, non-professional backgrounds of Dido Harding, some of the context that I think is important to understand here. And that's because whilst Harding might lack experience in public health, she does have other things going for her. So when it comes to landing government jobs, and it just so happens that Dido Harding is a Conservative peer in the House of Lords for the Conservative Party. She also, as it happens, is the daughter of a hereditary peer. So she's no stranger to the second chamber. Harding also just so happens to be married to a current Tory MP and former Tory minister, John Penrose. So he sits, her husband, on the advisory board of the 1848 group, which has called for the NHS to be replaced by an insurance system and for Public Health England to be scrapped. So her husband, ex-Tory minister, and an ex-Tory minister who sits on the board of an organisation which has called for Public Health England to be scrapped. Public Health England then gets scrapped, and his wife gets appointed the head of it. This is all obviously a joke, but it isn't. Why does this matter? Now, it probably doesn't need explaining that for the government in the middle of a pandemic to scrap our chief public health organisation, primarily just as an exercise in blame shifting, and then to replace the leader of that organisation, or to in the new organisation create as leader someone who is someone very closely connected to the government, a Tory peer, married to a Tory minister, to be put in charge of the next phase of our pandemic control. It's obviously, it's clear why that's corrupt, basically. We might as well use the C word here. But it is also a bigger problem. It's not just that this wasn't a fair process. It's not just that she wasn't necessarily the most qualified person for the job, even though there have been these huge fuck-ups and it doesn't seem like there was a fair, transparent process in employing this person. I've got no idea if she's competent or not. It could have been coincidence that when she was in charge of TalkTalk, thousands of people got hacked and they ended up getting the largest fine in the history of the telecommunications business. That could be a coincidence. But there is a broader problem, even if you give her the benefit of the doubt on all of these issues. And that's that if this pandemic, if this crisis has shown us anything, it's that we need people in positions of authority, positions of scientific, in crucial positions in the implementation of a COVID response. We need them to have some independence from government so they can speak truthfully and honestly about how everything is going. So if there are mistakes being made, they can be rectified. And we have seen that the government have been very intentionally trying to suppress that, even though it's obvious. I don't need to explain to you that it's important to have scientists and leaders of public health organizations who are able to tell the truth. The government have been actively suppressing that. We told you already when the chief nurse was going to speak at the daily press conference and she was going to say that Dominic Cummings probably should have followed the rules. She got scrapped from that briefing. And what it looks like to me is that in putting Dido Harding, someone who is, she is a Conservative peer. She'd married to a Conservative MP. Apparently, she's quite close friends with Matt Hancock because they both have a penchant for horse racing. I suppose typical there. She is someone who, what you can assure she will have is blind loyalty to the government. And what that means is that if there are features of the public health system of our pandemic response which go dramatically wrong in the future, she's not going to stand up in the public and say it. We're not going to know about it until after the event. And in fact, actually, as Stephen Riker said, in that piece that you can check out. I recommend it. It was in The Guardian this morning. And he said the test and trace system, which she is currently overseeing, one of the big problems with it is that it doesn't collect any statistics whatsoever on how many people are following the advice. So how many people once called stay in. And one possibility is that not many people are doing this because the government hasn't provided any means, any financial capacity for people to stay at home and not go to their jobs. They're probably just going to lose out on money, especially if they're self-employed. And to find out those statistics would be slightly embarrassing. So it's best not to know. So that's, I mean, it seems the approach that Dido Harding has brought to test and trace. And, you know, I think it's pretty likely she's going to bring exactly the same catastrophic approach to the successor to Public Health England. There's going to be loads more of these stories, obviously. I mean, there are so many incidences in this pandemic response where people who are close to the government, who seem fairly incompetent, get jobs because of blind loyalty, because they have said they will not speak out, or because you can assume they will not speak out against the government. It's one of the biggest problems we have had in this country when it comes to confronting coronavirus, probably why we've had the highest excess death toll in Europe. I'm going to ask you now to subscribe to this channel. If you are enjoying the show, especially if you're new to this show, hit the subscribe button, hit the notifications button. And I'm going to very briefly, actually, because I can't go through every instance of cronyism and revolving doors involving the British government, because I'd be here all evening. But it would be remiss to not mention the case of Sajid Javid. So he is obviously the ex-chancellor of the Exchequer. He quit the role after falling out with Boris Johnson, but rather than simply continue as a backbench MP representing his constituents, he's got other things keeping him busy. He's been hired by Wall Street giant JP Morgan. Now, if you're not familiar with JP Morgan, they are a multinational investment bank and financial service holding company. So the kind of company who have a lot of money resting on what kind of regulations are decided on by chancellors. By people who are in charge of the money of the treasury of any country. And it tells you, a couple of things. Actually, first of all, let's go to what they've said about it. So let's go to what JP Morgan have said. They've said, we are delighted to welcome Sajid back to JP Morgan as a senior advisor, and we look forward to drawing upon his in-depth understanding of the business and economic environment to help shape our client strategy across Europe, a spokesman for the bank said in a statement. Reuters obviously saying, welcome back, Sajid. It's because this isn't the first time he's worked for them. He worked for them before he went into Parliament and then again after Parliament. We can go to the details. Javid began his career in finance at Chase Manhattan, which later merged with JP Morgan, and worked in a number of roles in its currencies and emerging market business. He then joined Deutsche Bank, running several of the German lenders' trading businesses in Asia before being elected to Britain's Parliament in 2010. Now, this is the definition of revolving door. So what revolving door, or the revolving door in politics, means is you have people who move straight from businesses to government positions where those businesses are regulated, and then from those government positions back into business again. So you're working for JP Morgan, then you become treasurer. Do you think you're going to be objective when you're trying to regulate this company so that we don't end up with financial crises and exploitation of workers and consumers? When Sajid Javid knows that if he has to quit, which he did in the end, he can just go get a very high-powered job with them straight away afterwards, while he's still actually getting his MP salary. This is not like, he doesn't desperately need it. And as long as we have cabinet ministers who know that who know that after they quit, or while they're still MPs, they can get jobs with the high-powered industries they are supposed to be regulating, they've been elected to regulate, how can we expect anything other than a government which is completely in hock to corporate interests, the interests of the people who are ultimately going to pay them big, fat paychecks? Again, you couldn't make it up. I was going to say, I'm going to give you another story now, because this story kind of pissed me off. The next story is just as infuriating, I suppose. And before I do that, if you're enjoying the show, please go to novaramedia.com/support and donate the equivalent of 1 hour's wage a month. If you already do it, thank you very much. You make the show possible. If not, what are you waiting for? Our next story is about evictions. So this Sunday, the ban on evictions put in place to prevent mass homelessness during the coronavirus lockdown will be lifted. Landlords will be celebrating while thousands of tenants face the prospect of being kicked out of their homes. There's a great article up on novaramedia.com from Rivka Brown discussing this issue. You should check that out. But to go through some of the details for you now, It's estimated that 60,000 people have been served eviction notices since mid-March. Polling by YouGov suggests that 174,000 private tenants have already been threatened with eviction by their landlord or letting agent. So that 60,000 figure was about eviction notices which have already been communicated. That was actually on Landlord Zone, a website which I don't necessarily recommend you check out. YouGov, they're saying 174,000 private tenants in a poll. That's what they've worked out is the number of people who've had sort of vague threats from their landlord. So it hasn't quite been given out yet. Research by the housing charity Shelter estimates that the coronavirus crisis has put 227,000 private renters in England into arrears. Obviously, these stats show the inadequacy of the government's response to coronavirus. We've talked about it before. What they said was, we're going to ban evictions for 6 months, but we're not really going to do anything about the arrears you go into. And we're also not going to support you to not go into arrears. So what happens is you've got loads of people, you've got a time bomb, basically, which is waiting to explode, because you've got, as we've seen, hundreds of thousands of people who, because their incomes collapsed during coronavirus, and yes, some people were getting 80% wages on furlough, but there were many, many people who were excluded from that, who ended up on universal credit, or who ended up, if they're self-employed, with much lower incomes than they used to have. People who go into the red and end up, when that ban is lifted, in an incredibly vulnerable situation. The Labour Party, for their part, arguing that this ban should be extended. As we've talked about before, they don't have a particularly good policy on arrears, but they're at least saying the ban should be extended. But on the ground, community activists and tenants' unions have been laying the groundwork to support renters facing fallout from the coronavirus crisis. So earlier today, I spoke to Isaac Rose, who is an organiser with the Greater Manchester Tenants Union. And the first question I asked him was specifically about Manchester. So how much people in that city are going to be hit when this ban ends on Sunday? Are we going to see a surge of people getting evicted from their homes, or is this crisis going to develop as more of a trickle?
We're expecting to be badly hit, but this isn't going to be a sudden surge next week. So Shelter nationally expect around 230,000 households are in arrears in the private rented sector, and that's around 11,000 in Greater Manchester. But this won't be happening immediately next week. Currently, there is a regulations on evictions process notice that lasts for 3 months, which is in place till September. And as well as that, there'll be a big backlog through the courts. So this is going to be a rolling process that goes on through autumn and into winter, which will kind of be which will be built on when the furlough reduces and eventually goes, and more people are falling into arrears. So yeah, this isn't going to be something that's going to happen next week. It's going to be a process that rolls on right into the autumn.
And could you talk about the experiences of some of the people you've been working with, organising with, and also sort of how you are attempting to resist or prepare for what happens next?
Sure. So we've been supporting people across the summer. I mean, it's worth saying that landlords already are trying to evict people and are kind of trying to take the law into their own hands. Stories are very, similar. People have lost work. People have gone onto universal credit, which isn't sufficient to meet the rent. Landlords are kind of repeatedly threatening them with eviction. All throughout the summer. I mean, part of our work is basically pushing back against that, because landlords will often try their luck. And part of that is pushing back, supporting the tenants to feel confident in doing that, and generally equipping them with knowledge and kind of collective support, basically, from the union. And I guess more broadly, the way we're preparing for this is building up our capacities of member solidarity, raising awareness in kind of high-risk neighbourhoods with leaflet drops and making people aware that this support exists, and ultimately kind of planning a framework of resistance that takes cases right from, negotiating with landlords, supporting people with understanding what the situation is, and writing letters right up to, we expect through the autumn physical eviction resistances, basically.
I mean, you're an organisation that sort of organises on the ground, and the central focus isn't lobbying on policy, but from your experience, from your knowledge on the ground, what do you think would be the core policies that we should be demanding of the government to prevent a wave of evictions over the next months?
What we need is a kind of immediate extension of this ban into next year. This has already happened in Scotland and Wales. But I think more broadly, we're going to have to see cancellation of rent arrears, because in no way are these debts going to be repaid they would, in a payment plan that amounts to a kind of hiking of the rent. People are going to be saddled with debt. There needs to be a solution that cuts debt. But then I think more broadly, we need to totally reform the housing provision in this country. We need to be talking about rent controls, and we need to be talking about, mass council house building programs again, because ultimately those reforms would lie at the heart of kind of addressing the housing crisis more broadly.
And I suppose on a practical level, I'm sure you could give loads of advice on this, but in a very truncated way. If anyone is watching this show and is worried that they might be subject to an eviction, perhaps they're in rent arrears after the lockdown that they still haven't managed to pay off, what are the most important bits of advice that you would give to them today?
Sure. I think number one is, if you get that eviction notice, don't panic. This is a process. An eviction is a process. It's not a notice to immediately leave your home. And then after that, reach out to support organisations, join a tenants union, join LRU, Acorn, join ourselves, depending on where you are. And it's solidarity between yourselves and other renters in this situation. There are hundreds of thousands of people in this situation across the country that will kind of get us through this.
That was Isaac Rosen, organiser with the Greater Manchester Tenants Union. I'm going to go to some comments. Much of these about the section on cronyism. So we've got Tom Clare with a £5 super chat. Thank you very much. Tory skunks abolish the Lords. Agree. Rich Williamson, a £2 super chat. Tories seem untouchable, mafia-like. They have just been they haven't been overtaken in the polls by the Labour Party, but there's now there's only a 2-point lead between Labour and the Tories. I don't know if you guys believe polls, but I mean, it's moving in a direction which they won't be too pleased with. And Dylan with a £5 super chat says, getting my GCSEs tomorrow. Last little bit of good karma supporting the show that's kept me sane this summer. Dylan, thank you so much for your kind support. Good luck for your GCSEs tomorrow. Thank God the public outrage from your colleagues doing A-levels has forced the government into a U-turn so that you will get your centre-assessed grades and not grades pumped out by some, let's call it a classist algorithm. That's what I'm going to go with. We're going to go on to our final story in a moment. First of all, give this show a like. Go on. Doesn't cost you anything. Helps on the algorithm. Right. New polling has found unprecedented support for Scottish independence. Today, Savanta Comres released a poll showing support for independence at 54%. Another poll released today has support even higher for independence, which is stretching to double digits. So they have independence or pro-independence at 55%, no to an independent Scotland at 45%. That's a shift of 3 points in each direction since the last time Panel Base asked this question in early June. As far as I can tell, this is now the biggest lead that Yes has ever had in polls about Scottish independence. We can have a look at sort of how public opinion on this has shifted over time. We can scroll through the Wikipedia page. In fact, it's always actually my favorite source of information. So from 2014, you can see that polls, can we get this up? Immediately following the referendum, we got some polling which should show, some small leads, occasionally favouring independence straight after that referendum. Then we go into territory. When it's red, you can see that no has a majority. So that's most of the time. There's a brief period when Theresa May gets elected where support for independence goes back into positive territory. But it's only once we get into 2020, and especially in the last 3 months, that you end up seeing consistent and increasingly large leads for Yes, for people who want to have an independent Scotland. So to discuss whether this demand for independence is now unstoppable, and whether it's going to be the story that shapes British politics over the next 5 years, as well as the fallout from coronavirus, I'm joined by Michael Gray, a journalist at Scotia Media. How's it going, Michael? Thank you for joining us this evening.
I'm great. Good to see you.
I want to start by asking you, why is support surging? Presumably it's got something to do with the Tories, horrendous handling of coronavirus, but are there many factors? Why are we seeing this consistent, this large lead for people favouring an independent Scotland?
Well, independence is sexy and Boris Johnson isn't. I think the main arguments for independence, the democratic deficit and getting the power to make better decisions, have been repeatedly amplified over the past 9 months. It's not just COVID. First, you had the general election, a Tory victory in England, while the SNP won a landslide in Scotland. Then you had Brexit Day, a project rejected in all parts of Scotland. And then you had COVID, which placed Nicola Sturgeon's more cautious approach to lockdown against Boris Johnson, who's notoriously unpopular in Scotland. So that's what's led to the first significant lead for Scottish independence in modern UK history.
So I want to sort of hone down a bit on the Sturgeon issue, because I mean, I'm going to show a clip in a moment, which is why I find her so impressive as sort of a performer, you know, as a political operator. But in terms of coronavirus policy, it does seem somewhat curious, because basically, as far as the polls that I've seen suggest, the Scottish public are really satisfied with Nicola Sturgeon's approach to coronavirus. The English public, or the UK public, hate what Boris Johnson has done when it comes to coronavirus. But on some key policies, they've actually done the same thing. So in terms of having a late lockdown, the lockdown was, I mean, there was maybe a day in it or something, but it was basically as late in Scotland as it was in England. And then the second example is with exam results. So with exam results, both governments made basically the same mistake, which was to say we can have an algorithm that pumps out results based on the history of a school and a postcode, not on the performance of an individual. But whilst Boris Johnson seems to come out of this damage, Nicola Sturgeon, even though the same mistakes have been made, comes out of this, I mean, almost heroically. I mean, what's going on there?
I think there's a good piece by a writer called Rory Scowthorne for the New Statesman that he put out yesterday, I think, explaining how the SNP managed to sort of ride lots of horses. They're simultaneously the voice governing Scotland and the opposition voice at Westminster opposing what the Tories do. And I think that helps them in a lot of fronts. You know, they're challenged for following Westminster policy on lockdown on the early days. That's what the Tories told them to do. But then get the benefit from deviating and diverging on the timeline of lockdown. And that has been very popular in Scotland. And it's probably the first time Scottish people have ever had a government taking the major decisions in the midst of a national crisis. That can't be underestimated. So just the sense of leadership and of competence, it's not a high bar they're having to be in competition with the Tory government. And I think that does suit them well.
Yeah, I mean, there was an interesting interview. It was a while ago, actually, on Andrew Marr, where Nicola Sturgeon was saying, I think what this crisis shows us is actually the way to get Scottish independence. She was asked about the polling, obviously, is not to bang on about Scottish independence. It's to just show that we're really good at government, which, again, as I say, it seems like there's been some flawed responses to it, but they have, as you say, passed or exceeded the low bar, which is the UK government's response to this. In terms of performance, because from a superficial level, this is, you know, what I see of Nicola Sturgeon, what I find quite impressive is how she, you know, her capacity to respond both to politicians and to journalists. She's still been doing, as far as I know, daily press briefings. Boris Johnson dumped those ages ago. This is actually from a month ago or so, but I imagine, you know, there'll be a large section of our audience which haven't seen it. This is Nicola Sturgeon absolutely destroying a journalist, the kind of maneuver that you would not see from any politicians in the UK government at one of her daily press briefings. Let's take a look.
And lastly today, Terry Murden from Daily Business.
Good afternoon, First Minister. Just a couple of things. Firstly, following on from the various reports we keep getting on the economy, how soon can we expect a firm plan of action? And will you start by giving a commitment to some of the unfinished projects that we still have around? The second thing is
do you want to give an example of those?
Yeah, like the sort of hospital buildings and all that sort of thing. Will you be saying that you'll get on with it?
Give me one. I mean, obviously different projects will be at different stages of development and completion. So if there's a particular project you want to ask me about it.
Well, I've just mentioned a couple. There are various projects.
But hospital projects is a generic thing. Road building projects is generic. If there's a project you think is not being completed on time, ask me about that project and I'll answer or get you the answer to that question.
Okay.
So I love that clip. If you were watching the daily press briefings that happened at Downing Street, the sort of theme was generally, and we often talked about how they, you know, how the journalists often, you know, somewhat let them off the hook with their strategy. But in general, you had journalists who were asking somewhat precise questions or trying to ask precise questions, and the government sort of trying to wiggle out of them with vague generalities. And in this situation, what you got is a journalist asking a really vague and general question, and the politician, Nicola Sturgeon, saying sort of like, you need to be way more, you know, the tables were completely turned. And I mean, it does seem like there's just a much higher level of competence when it comes to Nicola Sturgeon and the Scottish government. And so I suppose my question would be sort of the extent to which the extraordinary support for the SNP and even for independence is for ideological reasons. Is this sort of a rebirth of sort of a romantic Scottish nationalism, or is it purely pragmatism that it seems like they're a more competent government in Holyrood than you've got in Westminster, so people are now willing to take the risk?
Yeah, it's a combination of both. I don't think it's a romantic or backward-looking type of nationalism. I think
romance doesn't have to be backward, but
yeah, it depends on what type of romance you're into. Like to link it back to the discussion of the show about sort of migrant rights and refugee rights. Like, for instance, the SNP has made a very successful project of presenting itself as a civic, inclusive, diverse type of movement, and has been often involved in a lot of the resistance to UK hostile environment and Home Office policies. So I think it's the SNP have been very successful since the referendum of combining a lot of the social movement influences that often went in behind the Corbyn project. For instance, the anti-Iraq war movement, Stop the War, the student movement against fees, and the anti-austerity movement. A lot of that in Scotland coalesced in the Yes campaign from 2012 to 2014, which then created this mass membership party, the post-2014 SNP. And that hasn't rescinded or gone backwards since then. It's given them this unique dominant position as the national party. They now do face a huge strategic challenge between now and next May, which is the date of the next Scottish Holyrood election. And their aim will be to win a majority in a partly proportional system, which will be a huge challenge. And then that will set up a conflict between the Scottish National Party with a mandate for a fresh independence referendum and the Tory government, whose position at the moment is just to say no, 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 never, which I think plays into Nicola Sturgeon's hands, presenting the UK government as the undemocratic voice, just refusing to allow the people of Scotland to decide.
And obviously who gets caught in the middle there is the Labour Party, an organisation we talk a hell of a lot about on this show. What's your perspective of, is there any way back for the Labour Party in Scotland? They, struggle to find a position. Well, I say they've struggled to find a position between independence and maintaining the union. But to be honest, they have always been for maintaining the union, but without sort of any charisma. What's gone wrong, and can they fight back?
Well, people with even a medium-length political memory will know that after Labour campaigned against independence alongside the Tories in 2014, they went from 41 Scottish MPs to 1 MP under sort of Blairite leadership of Jim Murphy. And so that's created this huge wedge between Labour and a lot of its traditional support. And with almost comic timing, today, on the day that Scottish independence has hit historic highs of support, the sort of poor Scottish Labour leader, Richard Leonard, had recorded an interview with STV doubling down in opposition, not just to independence, but on the democratic principle of whether there should be a future referendum at all. He's been driven in that direction by often by the right of the parliamentary group of the Labour Party at Holyrood, and his own job is kind of hanging by a thread at the moment, because similar to Corbyn, he's kind of been undermined and briefed against by some of those figures and some of his own colleagues. So there isn't any easy way back for Scottish Labour before next May. Personally, I wish they would talk up more ideas about economic sovereignty, public ownership, workplace democracy, ideas where the SNP are open to challenge. Within the SNP, there's people who are demanding more action on issues like rent controls, land reform and public ownership. And the best they can do is focus on those issues, but they risk being essentially run over by the sort of SNP monolith movement for independence.
Michael Gray, thank you so much for joining us this evening to talk about what is an issue which, could be, the massive story of the next 2 years, kind of underreported down in London and England. So we'll definitely be keeping a close eye on, this upsurge in support for Scottish independence. Michael Gray, thank you for speaking to us tonight. I say us, even though it's just me this evening. I'm not sure what you're supposed to do in that situation. I'm going to go to a couple of comments. So on the Sturgeon clip, Fox is saying he's also here. So yeah, he was joining me and Fox, the producer. Angela Leach with a £2 super chat says, unarmed idiots trying to trick the First Minister. That is a good analysis of that clip. Good summary. Bill Mackay 87 with a £4.99 super chat. Thank you very much. Asked, can we get a unison Gensec hustings on Tisky in October, November? That's an interesting idea, actually. We should look into that. There was also actually some interesting news in terms of the Unite Union today, which is that Len McCluskey, it seems, is going to step down at some point soon. His faction within the party is called United Left. Steve Turner won elections within that faction, although it's been disputed. Now, Howard Beckett apparently is also going to stand. So you've got two left candidates. Are we going to get a split vote? I'm not sure. We'll definitely come back to that on this show. We've had both of them on the show, both very good speakers, very amenable people. We've also got with a $4.99 super chat, David Corbett, who says, fantastic, informative show, as always, with a thumbs up. Big respect to Michael and Tisky Sour team with a beer. And the beer, actually, that's relevant because we haven't told you yet, but this is going to be the last Tisky Sour for a little while. I'm going to be taking a little break, only until the beginning of September. We'll be back the first Wednesday in September. I'm going to go for a week holiday, spend some time with my new niece, which is going to be lovely. And when we come back, we're going to have a bit of a new look. So you're going to notice some sort of upgrades in the visual features. And also we're going to have a new time. So we're going to be starting at 7 p.m. instead of 8 p.m. Obviously, if you don't get back from work until 8, you'll be able to watch it back or join the stream whenever you want. So to finish for this evening, thank you everyone for your super chats tonight. We do appreciate them. If you want to support us directly, then do go to novaramedia.com/support. If you haven't subscribed already, of course, hit the subscribe button. You've been watching Tisky Sour on Novara Media. See you in September.